Thunder cracked across the night sky, splitting the darkness with a momentary flash that illuminated the weathered barn. Inside, Thorn Mason knelt in the hay-strewn stall, his sleeves rolled up past his elbows, strong hands covered in blood and birthing fluid as he guided a newborn calf into the world. Rain hammered against the roof, creating a chaotic percussion that matched the pounding of his heart. "That's it," he murmured to the laboring cow. "Push now." The animal bellowed in pain and Thorn's hands trembled, not from the cold that seeped through the barn walls, but from the weight of the day. 10 years. A decade since Catherine had slipped away, leaving him with a newborn daughter and a son, too young to understand why his mother would never wake again. With a final heave, the calf slid into the world. Thorn quickly cleared its airways, rubbing its chest until the small creature took its first shuddering breath. He sat back on his heels, watching as the mother cow began to lick her newborn clean. "Welcome to this cruel world," he whispered to the calf, his voice rough from disuse. "It doesn't get any easier from here." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The cow lurched to her feet in panic, eyes rolling white. Before Thorn could move, she slammed into him, driving him against the stall wall. Pain exploded across his forehead as wood splintered under the impact. He slid to the ground, warm blood trickling into his eye from a gash above his brow. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing, another blow delivered on the anniversary of his greatest loss. "Fitting," he muttered to the empty barn as he pressed his sleeve against the wound. "Very fitting." The cabin door creaked open as Thorn trudged through the rain toward the faint glow of home. A tall, lanky figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, Luke, his stun rifle held loose, but ready in his hands. At 14, the boy already carried himself like a man accustomed to guarding what was his. "Pa," Luke said, lowering the gun when he recognized his father's familiar gait. His eyes widened at the blood streaking Thorn's face. "What happened? New calf," Thorn said, stepping inside and shaking the rain from his coat. "Mother didn't much appreciate my help." Without a word, Luke set the rifle aside and moved to the shelf where they kept medical supplies. He'd learned young how to tend wounds. Necessity was a harsh teacher on the frontier. Thorn eased himself into a chair by the hearth where embers glowed faintly. In the corner of the room, Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, bent over a scrap of paper. At 9 years old, she was small for her age, with a solemn face and eyes too old for her years. She glanced up at her father's entrance, then returned to her drawing without a word. Luke dampened a cloth and began cleaning the blood from his father's face. His touch was neither gentle nor rough, just efficient, like everything else the boy did. "Need stitches," he said flatly. Thorn nodded, wincing as Luke pressed the cloth against the open wound. "Do it then." The boy threaded a needle with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it many times before. No child should be so adept at such things, Thorn thought, not for the first time. But then no child should grow up motherless in a place like Willow Springs either. As Luke worked, the fever that had been threatening all day finally took hold. Sweat beaded on Thorn's forehead despite the chill in the cabin. His vision blurred, memories and present bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. "Elizabeth," he murmured, eyes half closed. "Please forgive me." Luke's hands faltered, needle poised mid-stitch. Something flashed across the boy's face, concern mingled with suspicion and a deeper emotion that might have been anger. "Who's Elizabeth?" he asked, voice carefully neutral. Thorn blinked, dragging himself back to the present. "No one," he said. "Just the fever talking." Luke's eyes lingered on his father's face a moment longer, searching. Then he returned to his work, jaw tight. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the scratch of Grace's pencil on paper. When Luke finished, he cut the thread and stepped back, regarding his handiwork with critical eyes. "Should hold," he said. "Thank you, son." Luke nodded once, then moved away to wash his hands. Thorn leaned back in the chair, allowing his eyes to close. The fever wrapped around him like a blanket, dragging him toward unconsciousness. The last thing he registered was Grace's small hand placing a folded piece of paper in his palm. He forced his eyes open long enough to see what she'd drawn, a woman's face rendered in the imprecise strokes of a child. A face Grace had never seen in life, constructed from descriptions and wishful thinking. "Catherine. Tomorrow's better, Pa." Grace whispered the most words she'd spoken all day. Thorn nodded, unable to form a response, as darkness claimed him. Willow Springs crouched at the edge of civilization like a predator, waiting to pounce. The town had sprung up as a watering stop along the stagecoach route, growing just enough to support a general store, a saloon, a small church, and the sheriff's office. Most of the buildings were weathered wood, their paint stripped away by sun and wind, until they all shared the same dusty gray pallor. Thorn rode into town with his hat pulled low over his freshly stitched wound. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few horses tied outside the saloon and a group of men gathered near the center of town. As he approached the general store, the sound of laughter, cruel and sharp, drew his attention to the crowd. He tied his horse and paused, watching from a distance. Something was happening in the town square, not the usual livestock auction, judging by the tone of the onlookers. Curiosity tugged at him, though he knew better than to get involved in Willow Springs business. Porter, the shopkeeper's wife, stood arranging canned goods in the window. She glanced up as Thorn approached, her lips thinning with disapproval. "Mr. Mason," she said stiffly, Here for supplies. Yes, ma'am. He handed her a short list of essentials, flour, coffee, ammunition, salt. As she gathered the items, she cast a disapproving look toward the crowd in the square. Disgraceful business, she murmured, selling those savages like cattle. Thorne's head came up sharply. What's that? Mrs. Porter sniffed. 3 Apache women. Military brought them in yesterday. Sheriff Blackwood says they're hostiles, but if you ask me, it's just an excuse for certain men to line their pockets. Something cold settled in Thorne's stomach. He paid for his supplies quickly, then moved toward the gathering crowd drawn by a mix of disgust and a strange compulsion he couldn't name. The auctioneer, a wiry man Thorne didn't recognize, stood on a hastily constructed platform. Beside him, 3 women stood with ropes binding their wrists. They wore simple dresses, likely provided by someone in town as a concession to modesty, but their feet were bare and crusted with dirt. Their long black hair hung loose tangled from travel and neglect. Despite their circumstances, all 3 women held themselves with remarkable dignity. The tallest stood with shoulders squared, her eyes burning with defiance as she surveyed the crowd. Beside her, another woman stared at some point in the distance, her face a mask of sorrow so profound it seemed carved from stone. The third, who appeared slightly younger than the others, watched the crowd with sharp assessing eyes that missed nothing. $6 for all 3, the auctioneer called, his voice cutting through the jeers and laughter. Who'll start the bidding at $6? The crowd responded with more laughter and crude suggestions about what the women might be worth. Thorne's hand tightened on the handle of his supplies until his knuckles whitened. Then the third woman spoke, her voice clear and precise, in perfect English. One day, you will all pay for this. The crowd fell silent, stunned by both her command of English and the quiet certainty in her voice. Something about that voice struck a chord in Thorne's memory, a half-forgotten melody from another life. The auctioneer recovered first, delivering a sharp cuff to the woman's ear that made Thorne's blood boil. Shut your mouth, savage, the man snarled. You'll speak when spoken to. I said $6, he continued, turning back to the crowd. Who'll give me $6 for 3 strong workers? Thorne found himself stepping forward before he fully registered the decision to do so. I'll pay the 6, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. Every head turned toward him. He could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some amused, a few openly hostile. Sheriff Blackwood leaned against a hitching post near the platform, watching the proceedings with hooded eyes. At Thorne's bid, he straightened his hand, moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. The scar that bisected his left cheek twisted as his face contorted with something like recognition. Mason, he said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. Thorne ignored him, keeping his eyes on the auctioneer. $6, he repeated. P. The auctioneer blinked, clearly expecting a longer bidding process. When no one else spoke up, most too stunned by the turn of events, he shrugged. Sold then, he said, $6 for the lot. As Thorne approached the platform, he finally allowed himself to look directly at the 3 women. The tallest glared at him with undisguised hatred. The sorrowful one didn't acknowledge him at all, her gaze still fixed on the horizon as though searching for something lost. But the third, the one who had spoken, studied him intently, her eyes lingering on the scar above his brow. Something flickered in her expression, too quick to read. Recognition impossible. Yet there was something familiar in the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders. The auctioneer thrust a ledger at him. Sign here, he said, and good luck with him. You'll need it. Thorne signed his name in the book, the scratching of the pen unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He counted out $6 silver, a pittance really for 3 human lives. As he handed over the money, a voice called out from the crowd. What you gonna do with 'em, Mason? Thinking you can tame wildcats in that shack of yours? Laughter rippled through the onlookers, edged with something uglier than mere amusement. Thorne didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that men with nothing worth saying often said the most. The auctioneer cut the rope that bound the women to the post, then shoved them roughly toward Thorne. They're your problem now, he said. The women stumbled forward, maintaining their balance despite the shove. Thorne reached out instinctively to steady the nearest one, the sorrowful woman, but she jerked away from his touch, her first real reaction since he'd arrived. This way, he said quietly, gesturing toward his wagon. The third woman, the one who had spoken, regarded him with calculating eyes. Why? She asked, her English clipped but clear. The crowd had begun to disperse, but several onlookers paused, waiting for his answer. Sheriff Blackwood remained by the hitching post, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. Thorne met the woman's gaze steadily. Not here, he said. I'll explain at the farm. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once. Without another word, she began walking in the direction he'd indicated, the other 2 women following closely behind. As they passed the sheriff, Blackwood spat on the ground near their feet. 15 years ain't long enough to forget what you are, Mason, he said, voice pitched low enough that only Thorne could hear. Thorne paused, the old wound in his side throbbing at the memory those words evoked. Likewise, Blackwood, he replied evenly. I remember exactly what you are. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun again, but he made no move to draw. Instead, his lips curved in a cold smile. You just made a big mistake, he said. Bigger than you know. Thorne turned away without responding. Some battles weren't worth fighting, not yet anyway. He followed the women to his wagon, aware of the eyes that tracked their progress through the dusty streets of Willow Springs. When they reached the edge of town, Thorne stopped and turned to the auctioneer who had trailed behind with the paperwork. "Cut their ropes," he said. The man looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. "Are you crazy? They'll bolt the minute—" "Cut the ropes," Thorne repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. The auctioneer hesitated, then shrugged and drew a knife from his belt. "Your funeral," he muttered, slicing through the bindings. The women rubbed their wrists, exchanging glances that spoke volumes in their silence. The crowd that had followed them to the edge of town murmured in disbelief. A few men called out warnings or placed bets on how quickly the Apache women would kill the foolish rancher. Thorne ignored them all. He climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. "You can walk beside the wagon or ride in the back," he told the women. "Your choice. But we've got a long way to go before dark." After a moment of tense silence, the woman who spoke English nodded to the others. They climbed into the back of the wagon, movements stiff from days of captivity. None of them looked at the townspeople, who continued to jeer and call out crude suggestions. As the wagon pulled away from Willow Springs, Thorne felt the weight of Sheriff Blackwood's stare burning into his back like a brand. Old wounds, it seemed, never truly healed. They just scabbed over, waiting for the right moment to break open and bleed anew. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady plodding of the horses' hooves on the dusty trail. The three women remained in the back, speaking occasionally to each other in low voices that Thorne couldn't understand even if he'd wanted to eavesdrop. When they reached a small creek that crossed the road, Thorne stopped to let the horses drink. He climbed down from the seat and stretched his back, aching from the long ride and the previous night's birthing. The women watched him warily as he moved to the back of the wagon. "There's water here," he said, gesturing to the creek, "if you're thirsty." For a moment, none of them moved. Then the English-speaking woman nodded to the others, and they carefully climbed down from the wagon. The tallest kept herself between Thorne and the others, her stance protective despite her exhaustion. "My name is Thorne Mason," he said as they knelt by the creek to drink. "My farm is about another hour's ride from here." The woman who spoke English looked up from the water, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "I am Maya," she said finally. "This is Wachiwi." She gestured to the tall, fierce woman, and Helona, the sorrowful one. Thorne nodded in acknowledgement. "You speak very good English." "My father was interpreter for the military." Maya said, her tone neutral, but with a hint of something harder beneath. "Before they killed him." Thorne absorbed this without visible reaction, though inwardly he winced. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, as though searching for mockery in his words and finding none. "Why did you buy us?" she asked directly. Thorne considered his answer carefully. The whole truth was too complicated, too tied to a past he'd spent years trying to forget. "I need help at the farm," he said finally. "I have 2 children who need looking after and no wife to do it." Wachiwi said something in Apache, her tone scornful. Maya responded, then turned back to Thorne. "She asked if you expect us to be your wives." "No," Thorne said firmly. "I expect nothing of that kind. You'll have food, shelter, and safety in exchange for help with the farm and the children. Nothing more." He paused, then added, "And you're not prisoners. I cut your ropes for a reason. You're free to leave if you want, though I can't promise you'll find a better situation out there." Maya translated for the others. Wachiwi responded with a burst of what sounded like angry questions. Helona simply stared at the rippling water of the creek, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. "Wachiwi wants to know why we should trust you," Maya said. "Many white men make promises they do not keep." Thorne nodded. "Fair question. I can't give you any reason to trust me except my word, which I know means little to you right now. But I swear on my children's lives that you'll be treated fairly at my farm." Maya studied him for a long moment, then translated his words. Wachiwi still looked skeptical, but some of the tension left her shoulders. "We will come to your farm," Maya said finally. "For now." The unspoken addition hung in the air between them, "until we decide otherwise." Thorne accepted this with a nod. It was more than he'd expected, given the circumstances. "We should keep moving," he said, glancing at the sun's position. "I'd like to get home before dark." The Mason farm came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It wasn't much to look at: a small cabin with a weathered porch, a barn in need of new siding, a chicken coop, and a few fenced fields where crops struggled to grow in the harsh Arizona soil. A thin curl of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, the only sign that anyone was home. As they approached, the cabin door opened, and Luke stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. He'd clearly been watching for his father's return. When he saw the 3 women in the back of the wagon, he froze, eyes widening in disbelief. "Pa," he called, voice cracking slightly. "What's all this?" Thorne pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. "Help with the farm," he said simply. "Put the gun down, Luke. They're not a threat." Luke lowered the rifle slightly but kept it ready. His eyes darted from one woman to the next, lingering longest on Wachiwi, whose imposing height and fierce expression seemed to unnerve him most. "Are they Apache?" he asked, the word loaded with all the fear and prejudice that permeated the frontier. Yes, Thorne said, climbing down from the wagon. And they're staying with us for a while. Where's your sister? As if summoned by the question, Grace appeared in the doorway behind Luke. She peered around her brother's legs, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. Come help with the supplies, Thorne told Luke, deliberately turning his back on the women to demonstrate his trust. After a moment's hesitation, Luke propped the rifle against the porch railing and moved to help unload the wagon. Maya, Wachiwi, and Helona climbed down from the wagon, their movements cautious as they took in their new surroundings. Grace watched them with undisguised fascination, especially Helona, who carried herself with a quiet grace despite her obvious sorrow. These ladies will be staying with us, Thorne told his children as he handed a sack of flour to Luke. This is Maya, Wachiwi, and Helona. They're going to help around the farm and look after you when I'm busy with the livestock. Luke's jaw clenched. We don't need looking after, he said. And you brought, he lowered his voice through not enough, Apache into our home after what they did to the Wilkins family last spring. That wasn't these women, Thorne said firmly, and I won't have that kind of talk in my house. They're our guests and they'll be treated with respect. Luke's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing more, stomping into the house with the supplies. Grace remained on the porch, still watching the women with curious eyes. Let me show you where you'll sleep, Thorne said to Maya, deliberately ignoring his son's outburst. It's not much, but it's dry and warm. Inside the cabin was sparse but clean. A large main room served as kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace along one wall. A ladder led to a loft where the children slept. A single door led to what was presumably Thorne's bedroom. You can sleep here by the fire, Thorne said, gesturing to the main room. I'll bring in some extra blankets. There's a wash basin outside if you want to clean up before dinner. Maya translated for the others. Wachiwi said something in response, her tone still suspicious. She asked where you will sleep, Maya said. In there. Thorne nodded toward the bedroom door. With the door closed, you'll have privacy out here. Some of the tension seemed to leave the women at this assurance. Helona spoke for the first time, and her voice so soft it was barely audible. Maya listened, then turned to Thorne. Helona asked if the little girl likes to draw, she said. She noticed the papers on the table. Thorne glanced at the crude drawings scattered across the table, Grace's constant companions. Yes, he said. Grace draws all the time. It's her way of speaking when words don't come easily. Maya nodded and replied to Helona, whose face softened slightly for the first time since Thorne had seen her. Helona was an artist in our village, Maya explained. She painted stories on hides and made dyes from plants and earth. Thorne filed this information away, a potential connection between his withdrawn daughter and this grieving woman. She's welcome to use Grace's supplies, he said. I'm sure Grace would like that. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Luke stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching the exchange with barely concealed hostility. Grace had slipped back to her usual spot by the hearth, but her eyes kept drifting to the three women, especially Helona. I'll start dinner, Thorne said, moving toward the kitchen area to give the women some space. Luke, go check on the new calf and make sure the mother's doing all right. Luke looked like he might protest, but after a moment of defiant eye contact with his father, he grabbed his coat and stalked out the door. He is angry, Maya observed quietly. Thorne sighed as he began preparing a simple stew. He's protective, he said, and he's heard stories about Apache raids since he was little. It'll take time for him to understand you're not a threat. Maya's eyes lingered on the door Luke had slammed behind him. And you, she asked, you do not fear us. Thorne paused, considering his answer carefully. I've learned that most people, red or white, are just trying to survive in a hard world, he said finally. I've more reason to fear most of the men in Willow Springs than I do three women who've been through hell. Something flickered in Maya's eyes, a reassessment perhaps. She said nothing more, but moved to help Helona and Wachiwi settle in the corner farthest from Thorne, where they could speak privately. Grace, sensing the shift in the room's energy, quietly gathered her drawings and moved to the table. She selected a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw, occasionally glancing up at Helona with shy curiosity. By the time Luke returned, scowling and mud splattered from the barn, Thorne had a pot of stew simmering over the fire. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense, but the initial shock had begun to fade into something more like wary coexistence. Dinner was a silent affair. The three women ate cautiously, as though expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. Luke shoveled stew into his mouth without looking up from his bowl. Only Grace seemed at ease, her eyes darting between the newcomers with undisguised interest. When the meal was finished, Thorne showed the women where the extra blankets were stored, then retreated to his room, leaving the door cracked just enough to hear if anything happened during the night. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Sheriff Blackwood's words echoed in his mind. 15 years ain't long enough to forget what you are. The past, it seemed, had found him again, despite his best efforts to outrun it. And now he'd brought three innocent women into whatever reckoning was coming. In the main room, he could hear the soft murmur of Apache voices as the women settled by the fire. The language was unintelligible to him, but the cadence was familiar, a ghost from another lifetime when he'd worn a uniform and carried different burdens. Thorne closed his eyes, knowing sleep would be elusive. The wound above his brow throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a pulsing reminder of vulnerability. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls like restless spirits searching for peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, all he could do was wait and listen alert for any sign of trouble from within or without. It was a familiar vigilance, one he'd maintained since the day Catherine died, and left him alone to protect what remained of their family. Except now the circle of his protection had widened to include three strangers with every reason to hate him. Thorne couldn't have explained why this felt right, even necessary. He only knew that when he'd seen them standing on that auction block, something long dormant had stirred in his chest. Not quite conscious, but close enough to make him act. As exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of Maya's penetrating gaze and the nagging sense that he'd seen those eyes before in another lifetime altogether. Luke couldn't sleep. The soft murmur of unfamiliar voices from below kept him alert, his body tense beneath a rough blanket. In the bed across the loft, Grace slept peacefully, untroubled by the strangers in their home. He didn't understand what his father was thinking. Three Apache women brought into their house like it was nothing, like the Wilkins family hadn't been found butchered just last spring, their scalps taken as trophies by Apache raiders. Like every story he'd ever heard about the savages wasn't filled with blood and horror. And the way his father had looked at the one called Maya Luke had seen something there, something he couldn't quite name, but that set his teeth on edge. There was history between them, or at least his father thought there was. Luke could read it in the way Thorne's eyes had followed her movements, careful and considering. Below, the voices quieted. Luke shifted to peer through the gap in the floorboards. The three women had settled on blankets near the fire, their faces illuminated by the dying embers. The tall one, Wachiwi, sat with her back against the wall, clearly planning to keep watch while the others slept. The quiet one, Helona, curled on her side, facing the fire, her expression still carrying that profound sorrow even in near sleep. Maya sat cross-legged on her blanket, staring into the flames. As Luke watched, she raised her head suddenly, her eyes finding the exact spot in the loft where he spied through the gap. He jerked back, hard hammering. There was no way she could have seen him in the darkness, yet he felt exposed, as though she'd looked straight into his thoughts. Luke rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. His father was hiding, something had been for years. The name that came out when he was feverish, Elizabeth, wasn't the first time Luke had heard it. Sometimes in his sleep, Thorne would call out that name, his voice ragged with something that sounded like regret. Who was Elizabeth? Not his mother. Her name had been Catherine. Luke had a vague memory of a woman with soft hands and a gentle voice, but the details had faded over the years, leaving only an ache where knowledge should be. And what was the significance of 15 years that the sheriff had mentioned Luke had been born 16 years ago, which meant whatever happened had been before his birth, but not by much. His father never spoke of his life before Willow Springs. Luke knew only that Thorne had fought in the army, had met Catherine somewhere back east, and had eventually settled here to raise cattle and crops on land that seemed determined to yield neither. There were hints of a darker past, the scar that puckered the skin along Thorne's left side, the nightmares that sometimes left him shouting in the darkness, the way his hand would drift to his hip, where a gun would hang when certain men rode past their farm. Luke had always told himself it didn't matter that the past was past, but now his father had brought strangers into their home, Apache strangers, and the past suddenly seemed very present indeed. He made a decision then in the darkness of the loft. Tomorrow he would ride into town alone. Billy Blackwood, the sheriff's son, had always hinted that he knew things about Thorne Mason, things that would make Luke's skin crawl, he'd said. Luke had never wanted to hear them before. Now he thought it might be time to listen. With that resolution, he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. Dawn broke in streaks of pale gold across the eastern horizon. Thorne rose with the sun, as he did every morning, moving quietly through his room to avoid waking the others. When he opened the door to the main room, he found Maya already awake, sitting by the freshly stoked fire. Their eyes met in the dim light, an unspoken question passing between them. "You sleep light," she observed softly. "Old habit," Thorne replied, keeping his voice low. "Hard to break." "Soldier habits," she said. It wasn't a question. Thorne nodded once, neither confirming nor denying. He moved to the kitchen area, beginning the familiar routine of morning coffee. "Your son does not want us here," Maya said, following him with her eyes. "Luke is—" Thorne paused, searching for the right words. "He's had to grow up too fast. Lost his mother when he was 4. He doesn't trust easily." And the girl Grace, Thorne's hand stilled briefly on the coffee pot. She never knew her mother. Catherine died, bringing her into the world. Maya absorbed this in silence. Then, "You called another name in your sleep last night. Elizabeth." Thorne's head came up sharply. "You heard that." "I was awake," Maya said simply. "The floor creaks when you turn into your bed." Thorne returned to preparing the coffee, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Elizabeth was someone I knew a long time ago," he said finally, "before Catherine." Maya seemed to sense his reluctance to elaborate. She changed the subject. "What work do you want us to do here?" Relieved Thorne outlined the daily tasks that needed attention. Cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden, watching Grace when he and Luke were working with the livestock. Maya listened attentively, occasionally asking a clarifying question. Wachiwi is strong, she said when he finished. She can help with heavier work if needed. Halona, she hesitated. Halona's spirit is wounded. She lost her husband and child before we were taken. Thorn nodded, understanding all too well the weight of such grief. She can work at her own pace, he said. There's no rush. Maya studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. You are not like the men in town, she said finally. No, Thorn agreed. I'm not. Before Maya could respond, the sound of movement from the loft announced that the children were waking. The conversation ended as the day began in earnest with all the tasks that kept the small farm functioning. Wachiwi and Halona emerged from sleep warily, their bodies tense until they remembered where they were. Thorn gave them space, busying himself with outdoor chores, while Maya explained the day's work to her companions. Luke descended from the loft with his usual scowl firmly in place. He grabbed a piece of bread from the table and headed for the door without a word. Where are you going? Thorn called after him. Check the fences on the north pasture, Luke replied without turning around. That's what you wanted done today, right? Thorn frowned. The north pasture was the furthest from the house, and the fences there were in good repair. But before he could question his son further, Luke was out the door, letting it slam behind him. Grace came down the ladder more slowly, her eyes immediately finding Halona, who sat quietly by the fire. The child approached cautiously, a piece of paper clutched in her small hand. When she reached Halona, she held out the drawing, a simple rendering of a woman's face. Mother, Grace said, one of the few words she spoke regularly. Halona looked at the drawing, then at the child. Something shifted in her expression, the sorrow giving way to a gentler emotion. She took the paper, carefully studying it as though it were a precious artifact. Then she patted the floor beside her, an invitation. Grace sat and Halona reached for the charcoal stick that had fallen from the child's hand. With delicate strokes, she began to add detail to the drawing, softening the eyes, adding texture to the hair. Grace watched transfixed as the crude sketch transformed under Halona's skilled hands. Thorn observed this interaction from the doorway, a complicated emotion rising in his chest. It had been so long since he'd seen Grace engage with anyone besides himself and Luke. The sight of her sitting companionably with Halona, focused on the shared activity of art, struck him as both beautiful and painful, a reminder of all Catherine had missed in their daughter's life. Maya appeared at his side, following his gaze. Halona had a daughter, she said quietly. About Grace's age. The child was sick for many months before she died. Halona sang to her every night, even when the little one could no longer hear. Thorn swallowed against the tightness in his throat. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Maya nodded. Perhaps they can heal each other a little, she said, watching as Halona guided Grace's hand to add a new element to the drawing. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thorn's straightened hand automatically reaching for the rifle propped beside the door. Maya tensed beside him, her body coiling like a spring ready to release. Stay inside, Thorn told her, stepping onto the porch with the rifle held ready but not aimed. A cloud of dust announced the rider before Thorn could make out his identity. As the figure drew closer, the sunlight glinted off a silver badge pinned to a dusty black vest. Sheriff Blackwood had come calling, and much sooner than Thorn had anticipated. The reckoning, it seemed, would not wait for him to be ready. Sheriff Blackwood rode into the yard like a thundercloud, dust billowing around his horse's hooves. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared beneath his black coat, the silver badge on his chest catching the morning light. The scar that bisected his left cheek pulled his mouth into a permanent half-sneer. Thorn stood on the porch, rifle held loose but ready. He could feel Maya's presence just inside the doorway behind him, tense and watchful. Mason, Blackwood called, drawing his horse to a stop several yards from the porch. Thought I'd pay a neighborly visit, see how you're settling in with your purchases. We're managing just fine, Thorn replied evenly. Don't recall inviting you out here, Sheriff. Blackwood's lips twisted into what might have been a smile on another man. Don't need an invitation to check on territorial matters. His eyes drifted to the doorway where Maya now stood, partially hidden by Thorn's body. Those Apache women are technically in military custody, just being held for questioning about some raids. Funny, Thorn said. That's not what the auctioneer said when he was selling them like cattle. A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. Temporary arrangement. For their own safety, you understand. But now I'm thinking they might have valuable information after all. His hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver. So I'll be taking them back to town. No, Thorn said simply. You won't. The air between them crackled with tension. From the corner of his eye, Thorn saw Wachiwi appear at the side of the cabin, a wood-cutting axe held ready in her powerful hands. Halona and Grace remained inside, but he could feel them watching through the window. You're interfering with the law, Mason, Blackwood said, voice hardening. That's a dangerous path to take. Maya stepped fully onto the porch, then her head held high despite the danger. We are not property, she said clearly. We were stolen from our homes, tied in the night after traders brought whiskey to our camp. Blackwood's eyes narrowed at her perfect English. Well, ain't you educated for a savage? He sneered. Makes you all the more valuable for questioning, doesn't it? There's nothing to question her about, Thorne said. She and the others have been nowhere near any raids. And how would you know that? Blackwood asked, his gaze shifting back to Thorne with sudden intensity. Unless you've been keeping company with Apaches more than folks around here realize. The accusation hung in the air, loaded with implication. Thorne didn't rise to the bait. I know, because I'm not a fool, he said instead. These women were half-starved and exhausted when they were brought in. They've clearly been captives for some time. Blackwood studied him for a long moment, calculation evident in his cold eyes. Finally, he sat back in his saddle. I'll be back at sundown tomorrow, he said, with more men and proper papers. His gaze swept over the small farm, taking in its vulnerabilities. Best prepare yourself, Mason. This isn't a fight you can win. He wheeled his horse around and spurted into a trot, calling over his shoulder, 15 years is a long time to hold a grudge. But some debts need paying one way or another. Thorne watched until Blackwood disappeared over the ridge dust, settling in his wake. Only when the sheriff was completely out of sight did he lower the rifle. What did he mean? Maya asked quietly from beside him. About 15 years in debts. Thorne's jaw tightened. Old business, he said. Nothing for you to worry about. Maya's eyes lingered on his face, searching. You and he, Apache Pass. Thorne's head snapped toward her, surprise momentarily overcoming his carefully maintained composure. What do you know about Apache Pass? Before Maya could answer, Luke appeared from the direction of the barn, eyes wide with alarm. Pa, was that Sheriff Blackwood I saw riding away? Thorne pulled himself together, tucking away the questions Maya's words had raised. Yes, he said. Thought I told you to check the north pasture fences. Luke shifted uncomfortably. I was checking the horses first. What did the sheriff want? Trouble, Thorne said simply. He's coming back tomorrow at sundown with men. Says he's taking Maya and the others back to town. Luke's expression was unreadable. Maybe that's for the best, he said after a moment. They don't belong here, Pa. They're staying, Thorne said, his tone brooking no argument. Now go check those fences like I asked. We've got work to do. Luke stood his ground, a muscle working in his jaw so like his father in that moment that it was almost painful to see. Why are you doing this? Risking everything for them? Thorne sighed, suddenly weary beyond words. Because it's right, he said. And because I've spent too many years watching injustice and doing nothing. Now go. Luke stared at his father for a long moment, conflict clear in his young face. Then he turned abruptly and stalked toward the barn, shoulders rigid with unspoken anger. Maya watched him go, then turned back to Thorne. Your son needs answers, she said softly. As do I. Answers don't always make things better. Thorne replied, his eyes still on Luke's retreating figure. Sometimes they just reopen old wounds. And sometimes, Maya said, wounds must be reopened to properly heal. Thorne had no response to that. He turned and headed toward the fields, needing distance and the simple clarity of physical labor. But Maya's words followed him, echoing in his mind like a prophecy he wasn't ready to hear. Luke saddled his horse with quick, angry movements, his thoughts churning like storm clouds. His father was risking everything, their farm, their safety, their standing in the community for 3 Apache women he'd known for less than a day. It made no sense unless there was something Thorne wasn't telling him. The name Elizabeth, the 15 years Blackwood had mentioned, the way his father and Maya had looked at each other like two people recognizing ghosts. He led the horse from the barn, glancing toward the fields where his father was now working, bent over the struggling corn with single-minded focus. Luke hadn't planned to go into town until later, but with Blackwood's visit, the need for answers felt suddenly urgent. He mounted and turned the horse toward Willow Springs, keeping to the back trail that skirted the edge of their property. If his father saw him heading toward town, there would be questions Luke wasn't ready to answer. The ride took nearly an hour, giving Luke plenty of time to rehearse what he would say to Billy Blackwood. The sheriff's son was 2 years older than Luke and ran with a rough crowd, young men who spent more time at the saloon than working their families' ranches. Billy had always seemed to take a particular interest in Luke, dropping hints about Thorne's past that Luke had previously ignored. Now those hints seemed like pieces of a puzzle Luke needed desperately to solve. Willow Springs was quiet when he arrived, a mid-morning lull before the saloon filled with its regular patrons. Luke tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, knowing Mrs. Porter would be able to direct him to Billy's whereabouts. The shopkeeper's wife looked up from her sweeping surprise flickering across her face. Luke Mason, she said, shouldn't you be helping your father with that farm of yours? Ma'am. Luke nodded respectfully. Pa sent me for some supplies he forgot yesterday. The lie came easily, born of necessity. Wouldn't happen to know where I might find Billy Blackwood. Would you Pa asked me to deliver a message to the sheriff, but I thought maybe Billy could save me the trouble. Mrs. Porter's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly suspicious of the errand. Billy's likely down at Miller's stables, she said finally. That boy hasn't done an honest day's work in months, but he likes to hang around where the men gather. Thank you, ma'am, Luke said, backing toward the door. I'll just stop by there before I get the supplies. Outside, Luke headed toward the stables at the edge of town, his heart beating a little faster with each step. He wasn't supposed to be here, Wasn't supposed to be seeking out Billy Blackwood or asking questions about his father's past. But the alternative, sitting by while Thorne risked everything for strangers, seemed impossible. He found Billy lounging against the stable wall with two other young men, passing a cigarette between them. Billy straightened when he spotted Luke, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, look who it is," he drawled. "Luke Mason, all the way from that dirt patch you call a farm." "What brings you to town, farm boy?" Luke ignored the mocking tone, focusing on his purpose. "Need to talk to you," he said, alone. Billy raised an eyebrow, but after a moment, he nodded to his companions. "Give us a minute, boys." When they had sauntered off, he turned back to Luke. "What's so important you had to track me down?" Luke took a deep breath. "Your father came to our farm this morning. Something about Apache women and a debt from 15 years ago." Billy's expression sharpened with interest. "So the old man finally made his move," he said. "Been waiting for that ever since your pa brought those squaws home." "What's it all about?" Luke pressed. "What happened 15 years ago between our fathers?" Billy studied him for a moment, seeming to enjoy having information Luke wanted. "You really don't know, do you?" he said finally. "Your father never told you about Apache Pass, about how he got that scar on his side." Luke shook his head, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. "He doesn't talk about the past." "I bet he doesn't," Billy said with a humorless laugh. "Not when he's got desertion and treason hanging over his head." "What are you talking about?" Luke demanded, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Billy leaned in, clearly relishing the moment. 15 years ago, your father and mine were stationed together at Fort Bowie. Your pa was a captain, my pa his lieutenant. They were sent to investigate reports of Apache raiders using a particular pass to attack settlements. He paused, dragging out the story. "When they found the Apache camp, your father lost his nerve. Wouldn't give the order to attack. Said there were women and children there, like, that mattered when settlers were being scalped in their beds." Luke's throat felt dry. "That doesn't sound like desertion." "I'm getting to that part," Billy said. "When my father tried to take command and do what needed doing, your pa drew on him, actually pulled his gun on a fellow officer." Billy's eyes gleamed with the telling. "There was a struggle, your father was wounded, but he managed to escape into Apache territory. Disappeared for months. When he came back, he had a different name and a new wife, claiming he'd been back east all along." Luke shook his head, trying to reconcile this story with the man he knew. "That can't be right," he said. "My father wouldn't desert. He wouldn't betray his men." "Ask him yourself," Billy shrugged. "Ask him about Elizabeth Blackwood while you're at it. My aunt, the woman he was engaged to before he ran off with your mother." The name hit Luke like a physical blow. Elizabeth. The name his father called in his fever dreams, in his nightmares. "You're lying," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Billy smiled, seeing the doubt in Luke's face. "Am I? Then why did your father bring home 3 Apache women yesterday? Why is he risking everything to protect them?" He leaned closer, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Maybe because one of them saved his life after he deserted. Maybe because he's been in league with the Apache all along." Luke took a step back, suddenly needing distance from Billy and his poisonous words. "My father is a good man," he said, the declaration sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Your father is a deserter and a traitor," Billy said flatly. "And now he's brought the enemy right into your home. Better choose your side carefully, Mason. When my father comes back tomorrow, he won't be alone, and he won't be taking no for an answer." Luke turned and walked away, unable to bear another word. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he knew of his father with the story Billy had told. It couldn't be true, and yet it would explain so much. The nightmares, the scars, the way Thorne avoided town and kept to himself. The name Elizabeth spoken in the dark with such regret. And now 3 Apache women in their home, one of whom seemed to know Thorne from before. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture Luke wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. As he mounted his horse for the ride home, one thought kept circling in his mind. Who was the man he had called father all these years? And when Sheriff Blackwood returned tomorrow, whose side would Luke be on? While Luke sought answers in town, Thorne worked the fields with grim determination, as if he could somehow plow away the past that had resurfaced with Blackwood's visit. The corn was struggling in the dry soil, the stalks stunted, and leaves yellowing despite his best efforts. Like everything else in his life, Thorne thought bitterly the farm existed in a state of perpetual struggle, neither thriving nor failing completely, just enduring from one season to the next. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Maya's approach until her shadow fell across the furrow where he knelt. He looked up, squinting against the midday sun that haloed her figure. "Your son has gone to town," she said without preamble. Thorne straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "What do you mean he's supposed to be checking the north pasture fences?" "He took a horse and rode toward Willow Springs," Maya said. "I saw him from the hill where I was gathering herbs for Helona." Thorne cursed under his breath. "How long ago?" "Nearly an hour. He was taking the back trail, keeping out of sight." The implications were clear. Luke was seeking information about Thorne, about the women, about the past that Blackwood had hinted at during his visit. And there was only one person in Willow Springs who would be eager to fill Luke's head with poisonous half-truths. Billy Blackwood, Thorne muttered, already moving toward the house. He needed to be ready when Luke returned, needed to find the words to explain what had happened 15 years ago without reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Maya fell into step beside him. The sheriff's son. Thorne nodded grimly. They've crossed paths before. Billy's always been too interested in Luke, probably on his father's orders, trying to turn my son against me. With lies. Maya asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp. Thorne slowed his pace, glancing at her. With twisted versions of the truth, he said finally, which can be more dangerous than outright lies. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. You know what happened at Apache Pass? Thorne said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Maya's steps didn't falter. I was there, she said simply. Thorne stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Then you were the one who found me, he said, the realization dawning. After Blackwood left me for dead. Maya met his gaze steadily. I found a wounded soldier who had tried to stop his men from killing women and children, she said. I did not know your name then. I only knew you were different from the others. The memory rose in Thorne's mind, hazy with the passage of time and the fever that had nearly claimed his life. A young woman with gentle hands and determined eyes singing softly as she tended his wounds in a hidden cave. The same woman who now stood before him, 15 years older, but unmistakably the same. You saved my life, he said quietly. And now you have bought mine, she replied. Perhaps the circle is complete. But Thorne shook his head. Blackwood won't let it end here, he said. He's carried his hatred for 15 years, let it fester until it's consumed him. He won't stop until he's destroyed everything I care about. Then we must be ready when he comes, Maya said. She hesitated, then added, your son deserves to know the truth, before he hears Blackwood's version and believes it. Thorne knew she was right, but the prospect of laying bare his past, of seeing the disappointment and judgment in Luke's eyes, filled him with dread. For 10 years he had been simply Thorne Mason, widower and struggling farmer. The man he had been before Captain Thomas Monroe, decorated officer turned alleged deserter, seemed like someone from another lifetime. I'll tell him, Thorne said finally, when he returns from town, if he'll listen. Maya nodded, satisfaction in her eyes. Good. Now we should prepare for tomorrow. Blackwood will bring men, and they will not come to talk. Together they continued toward the house where Wachiwi was chopping wood with efficient, powerful strokes. Through the window, Thorne could see Grace and Helona still bent over their drawings, creating a small island of peace in the gathering storm. Whatever came tomorrow, Thorne silently vowed he would protect them, all his children, and these three women who had so unexpectedly become part of his household. Even if it meant finally confronting the past he had spent 15 years trying to escape. Luke returned late in the afternoon, dust-covered and tight-lipped. He stabled his horse without a word to anyone, then headed straight for the house, shoulders hunched, as if against a cold wind, despite the warm day. Thorne intercepted him on the porch. We need to talk, son. Luke's eyes, so like Catherine's in shape and color, met his briefly before sliding away. About what? How you lied to me my whole life. So he had spoken to Billy after all. Thorne sighed heavily. Not here, he said. Come with me to the barn. There are things you need to know, and I'd rather the women not overhear. For a moment, Luke looked like he might refuse. Then he gave a curt nod and followed Thorne to the barn, where the smell of hay and livestock created a familiar, comforting atmosphere, despite the tension between them. Thorne closed the door and leaned against it, facing his son in the dimly lit space. What did Billy Blackwood tell you? Luke paced a few steps away, then turned back, anger and confusion warring in his young face. He said you were a deserter, that you abandoned your men at Apache Pass because you were too cowardly to attack an Apache camp. His voice cracked slightly. He said you were engaged to his Aunt Elizabeth before you ran off with Ma. Thorne absorbed the accusations without flinching. He had expected no less from Sheriff Blackwood's son. Some of that is true, he said carefully, but not in the way Billy told it. Will you hear my side of it? Luke's jaw worked, but he nodded stiffly. Thorne took a deep breath, organizing thoughts he had kept buried for so long. 15 years ago, I was Captain Thomas Monroe of the 4th Cavalry, he began, stationed at Fort Bowie with Lieutenant Daniel Blackwood under my command. We were tasked with finding Apache raiders who had been attacking settlements in the territory. He moved to a bale of hay and sat suddenly, feeling the weight of his years and memories. We tracked a group to what Blackwood claimed was a raider camp in Apache Pass. But when we found it, I saw it wasn't raiders at all, just families. Women cooking, children playing, old men sitting in the sun. No weapons except for a few hunting bows. Luke remained standing, arms crossed defensively across his chest, but he was listening. I ordered the men to stand down. Thorne continued, but Blackwood countermanded me, said we had orders to eliminate the Apache threat, and these people were just as guilty as the raiders. His voice hardened at the memory. He told the men to open fire on the camp. Did they? Luke asked, his voice small. Thorne nodded grimly. Some did. I tried to stop it, drew my weapon, yes, but to fire into the air to shock them into obeying my order to cease fire. Blackwood came at me. We struggled. His knife found my side. Unconsciously, Thorne's hand drifted to the scar that ran along his left ribs. I fell. The last thing I remember is Blackwood standing over me, telling the men I'd lost my mind, that I was a traitor who'd sided with the Apache. What happened then? Luke asked, drawn into the story despite his resistance. I should have died there, Thorne said simply. But someone found me, a young Apache woman with knowledge of healing. She took me to a cave, treated my wounds, kept me alive through the fever. He looked at Luke steadily. That woman was Maya. Luke's eyes widened. The one you bought yesterday? That's why you did it, because she saved you. Partly, Thorne acknowledged. I didn't recognize her at first. It's been 15 years, and I was barely conscious for most of our time together back then. But when I heard her voice at the auction, something felt familiar. What about after? Luke pressed. Billy said you disappeared for months, then came back with a new name and mom. Thorne nodded. By the time I recovered enough to travel, Blackwood had already reported me as a deserter who'd abandoned his men in hostile territory. There was a price on my head. I couldn't go back to the fort or clear my name without being arrested or worse. He sighed, the old pain washing over him anew. So I made my way east to St. Louis. That's where I met your mother. We married quickly, too quickly, maybe, but we were young and in love. I took her maiden name Mason, and we headed west again, as far from Fort Bowie as we could get, while still finding land to farm. And Elizabeth? Luke asked quietly. Billy said she was Blackwood's sister, that you were engaged to her. A shadow crossed Thorne's face. Elizabeth Blackwood, he said softly. Yes, we were engaged before I went west. She was Daniel's younger sister, kind, gentle, everything he wasn't. When I was reported dead or deserted, she was devastated. I couldn't contact her without revealing I was alive, couldn't explain what had really happened. So you left her, Luke said, accusation creeping back into his voice, and found Ma instead. It wasn't like that, Thorne protested. I mourned Elizabeth, thought of her often, but I truly loved your mother, Luke. Never doubt that. Luke was silent for a long moment, processing everything he'd heard. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked finally. Why keep it secret all these years? At first it was for safety, yours and your mother's, Thorne explained. If anyone connected me to Captain Monroe, we would have been in danger. Then after Catherine died, he trailed off, searching for the right words. It seemed easier to leave the past buried, to be simply Thorne Mason, farmer and father, rather than a man with a price on his head and blood on his hands. And now, Luke challenged, Blackwood knows who you are. He's coming tomorrow with men. What happens to us then? I don't know, Thorne admitted, but I can't let him take Maya and the others. Not after what he did at Apache Pass. Not when I know what fate awaits them in his custody. Luke studied his father's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. So you're willing to risk everything, our farm, our lives, for 3 Apache women, for some debt from 15 years ago. Not just for them, Thorne said quietly, for what's right, for the man I want to be, the man I want you to see me as. He stood, moving closer to his son. I've spent 15 years running from who I was, Luke. Maybe it's time I stood my ground instead. Luke didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft sounds of animals shifting in their stalls and the distant call of a mourning dove outside. I need time to think, he said, finally turning toward the barn door. This is a lot. Thorne nodded, recognizing that pushing further would only drive his son away. Take the time you need, he said, but remember Blackwood comes at sundown tomorrow. Whatever you decide, I'd like to know where you stand before then. Luke paused with his hand on the door latch. Without turning, he asked, do you ever regret it, standing against Blackwood that day? I regret that I couldn't stop him, Thorne replied honestly. I regret the lives lost because I failed. But no, I don't regret refusing to participate in a massacre. Some lines can't be crossed, Luke, not even in war, not even on orders. Luke nodded once, then slipped out the door, leaving Thorne alone with memories he had kept at bay for far too long. The cabin was quiet that evening, the usual sounds of dinner preparation muted by the tension that had settled over the household. Wichiwi moved silently through the kitchen area, helping Maya prepare a simple meal, while keeping a watchful eye on the windows. Helona sat with Grace at the table, their heads bent together over a new drawing, this one showing a horse in surprisingly graceful lines. Luke had retreated to the loft after his conversation with Thorne, appearing only briefly for dinner, before climbing back up the ladder, his face closed and thoughtful. Thorne let him be, knowing his son needed space to absorb everything he had learned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Thorne stepped onto the porch to check the perimeter one last time before darkness fell completely. The evening air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He heard Maya's soft footsteps behind him before she spoke. Your son is troubled. Thorne nodded without turning. He has reason to be. His whole understanding of who I am has been upended. Maya moved to stand beside him, her gaze following his out across the darkening landscape. Children are resilient, she said, more than we give them credit for. I hope you're right, Thorne said, because tomorrow everything changes, again. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. In the distance, a coyote called its lonely cry, echoing across the hills. "May I ask you something?" Maya said finally. Thorne glanced at her, noting the way the last light of day softened the angles of her face. "Of course. This woman, Elizabeth," she said carefully. "Do you still love her?" The question caught him off guard. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to think of Elizabeth in those terms as someone he had once loved, rather than just another loss in a life marked by them. "I don't know," he answered truthfully. "The man who loved Elizabeth died at Apache Pass in many ways. I've been Thorne Mason for so long now that Thomas Monroe feels like someone else entirely." Maya considered this, her expression thoughtful. "And what does Thorne Mason want beyond surviving tomorrow?" It was a question Thorne had avoided asking himself for years. What did he want to farm land that yielded little but hardship? To raise children in isolation burdened by secrets? To live and die alone in a cabin filled with ghosts? Peace, maybe, he said slowly. A chance to stop running. To make amends for the things I couldn't change. He looked at her directly. "What about you? What does Maya want beyond surviving tomorrow?" A small smile curved her lips. "Home," she said simply. "For myself and for Wachiwi and Halona. A place where we can live without fear. Where Halona can heal from her losses. Where Wachiwi can use her strength for building, not just surviving." Thorne nodded, understanding. "And if you could go back to your people?" Maya's smile faded. "There is little to go back to," she said softly. "Many of our band were killed at Apache Pass. Others died of sickness in the winters that followed. Those who remain have been forced onto the reservation at San Carlos." She shook her head. "It is a place of death, not life." The weight of her words settled over Thorne like a physical burden. He had known intellectually the cost of what had happened at Apache Pass. But hearing it from Maya, understanding that her entire way of life had been destroyed in part because he had failed to stop Blackwood, made the guilt freshly acute. "I'm sorry, boss," he said, the words utterly inadequate. "For all of it." Maya turned to face him fully, her eyes intent on his. "You tried," she said. "When others did nothing, you stood against the killing. That is why I saved you then. And that is why I trust you now." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, that their lives had been intertwined by fate long before yesterday's auction. Thorne felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation, and everything to do with the quiet strength she radiated, the wisdom in her eyes. Before he could respond, the cabin door opened, and Grace peeked out, her small face solemn in the gathering darkness. "Papa," she said, using the childish name she rarely spoke aloud anymore. "Halona wants to show you something." Thorne exchanged a look with Maya, the moment between them passing but not forgotten. "Coming, sweetheart," he said, following Grace back inside. Halona sat at the table, a large piece of paper spread before her. On it, she had drawn a detailed map of the area surrounding the farm, marking trails and water sources with remarkable accuracy for someone who had only just arrived. "For tomorrow," Maya explained, coming in behind Thorne. "Halona knows this land. Her people hunted here before the soldiers came." Thorne studied the map with growing appreciation. It showed several hidden approaches to the farm that he hadn't known existed, narrow game trails through the hills that would allow someone to come or go unseen. "This could be useful," he said, tracing one of the marked paths with his finger. "If things go badly tomorrow, these routes could provide escape options." Maya translated it for Halona, whose face remained solemn, but whose eyes showed a flicker of pride at Thorne's approval. She pointed to a specific spot on the map and spoke rapidly in Apache. "She says there is a cave here," Maya translated, "hidden by trees and rocks. A good place to hide the children if fighting comes." Thorne nodded, memorizing the location. "Thank her for me," he said. "This may save lives tomorrow." As Maya conveyed his words, Thorne became aware of movement in the loft above. Luke was listening, though he hadn't come down to join them. Whether that was a good sign or not, Thorne couldn't tell. Wachiwi approached the table, speaking to Maya while gesturing toward the barn. "Wachiwi says we should move the livestock to the far pasture tomorrow," Maya explained, "away from the house in case there is shooting." Thorne agreed. "Oh, good thinking. We'll do that in the morning." He looked around at the three women who were now actively helping prepare for Blackwood's return. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't ask to be part of this fight." Maya's eyes met his across the table. "Some fights choose us," she said. "We can only decide how we face them." With those words hanging in the air, they continued their preparations long into the night, planning for a confrontation. None of them wanted, but all knew was coming. And above them, in the shadows of the loft, Luke listened and considered, weighing loyalty against truth, past against present, in the balance of his young heart. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the sleeping land. Inside the cabin, Grace and Luke had retired to the loft while Halona slept on a pallet near the hearth. Wachiwi sat by the window, keeping watch, despite Thorne's assurance that Blackwood wouldn't come before the stated time. Unable to sleep, Thorne had stepped outside for air, the weight of tomorrow's confrontation heavy on his mind. The night was unnaturally quiet. No coyotes calling, no owls hunting, as if the very creatures of the desert sensed the coming storm and had gone to ground. He wasn't surprised when the cabin door opened behind him and Maya emerged wrapped in a shawl against the night's chill. They had developed an unspoken awareness of each other in the short time since she had arrived, a connection that defied simple explanation. "You should rest," she said, coming to stand beside him at the porch railing. "Tomorrow will require strength." "I could say the same to you," Thorn replied. Maya smiled faintly. "I am used to little sleep. In my village, I was often called to tend the sick at night. The habit remains." They stood in comfortable silence for a time, watching the moon's slow journey across the star-filled sky. The air between them hummed with unspoken thoughts, questions that had no easy answers. "I remember you singing," Thorn said suddenly. "In the cave when I was wounded. A song I didn't understand, but it anchored me somehow. Kept me from slipping away when the fever was at its worst." Maya looked at him with surprise. "You remember that?" Thorn nodded. "Not much else from those days. Just fragments, pain, darkness, your voice, keeping me tethered to the world." "It was a healing song," Maya said softly. "Passed down from my grandmother, who was also a healer. The words ask the spirits to strengthen the body and calm the mind." She hesitated, then added, "I was not sure you would live. The knife went deep, and infection had set in by the time I found you." "Why did you help me?" Thorn asked the question that had lingered in his mind since he recognized her. "I was a soldier, the enemy." Maya's gaze returned to the distant mountains silvered by moonlight. "I saw you try to stop the killing," she said simply. "When the others opened fire on our people, you stood against them. You were wounded because you tried to protect the innocent." She looked back at him. Such a man deserved to live, enemy or not. The weight of her words settled over Thorn like a mantle, a recognition of the choice he had made 15 years ago, and the price he had paid for it. A choice that had cost him his career, his identity, and indirectly perhaps even Catherine. "I failed," he said, the admission torn from some deep place within him. "People died because I couldn't stop Blackwood." "You tried," Maya insisted. "When others did nothing, you acted. That matters." She paused, then added quietly, "It mattered to me." Something in her tone made Thorn turn to face her fully. In the moonlight, her features were softened, her eyes reflecting the stars above. For a moment, they stood suspended in time, the years between their first meeting and this one collapsing like a house of cards. "Maya," he began, not entirely sure what he meant to say. She shook her head slightly, stopping his words. "We face danger tomorrow," she said. "What comes after, if we survive, is a question for another night." Thorn nodded, understanding. There was something growing between them, a connection, a possibility, but tomorrow's confrontation loomed too large to see beyond it clearly. "You should go inside," he said gently. "Try to rest. I'll keep watch for a while." Maya hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm briefly. "Do not carry all the weight alone, Thorn Mason," she said. "You are not the only one with strength to offer." With that, she turned and went back inside, leaving Thorn alone with the night and his thoughts. He remained on the porch for a long time, watching the moon track across the sky, his mind turning over possibilities and plans for the coming day. When he finally went inside, the cabin was quiet. The only sounds the soft breathing of the sleepers and the occasional pop from the banked fire. He moved to his room and stretched out on the bed, not expecting sleep, but needing to rest his body at least. As he drifted in the space between wakefulness and dreams, a memory surfaced, Maya singing softly in the cave as she tended his wounds, her voice a lifeline in his darkest hour. The same woman who now slept beneath his roof, whose presence had somehow reawakened parts of himself he'd thought long dead. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But for tonight, Thorn allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in years. Not quite hope, perhaps, but a sense that, whatever happened, he was no longer facing the world entirely alone. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sun rising over the eastern hills to paint the land in shades of gold and amber. Thorn woke from a fitful sleep, instantly alert to the sounds of movement in the main room. He dressed quickly and stepped out to find Wachiwi already up, stoking the fire, while Maya prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. "You slept," Maya observed with a hint of approval. "Some," Thorn acknowledged. He glanced toward the loft where there was no sign of movement yet. "The children?" "Still sleeping," Maya said. "The girl had bad dreams in the night. Helona sat with her until she settled." Thorn's gaze moved to Helona, who sat quietly by the window watching the sunrise with pensive eyes. She seemed more present today, less lost in her grief, though the sorrow still marked her face like a shadow. "Thank you," he said to her directly, though he knew she wouldn't understand his words, "for watching over Grace." Maya translated, and Helona inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. She spoke briefly in Apache, her voice soft but clear. "She says the child draws her mother's face to remember," Maya translated, "as Helona draws her husband and daughter. It creates a bridge between worlds." Thorn nodded, moved by the connection Helona had formed with his daughter in such a short time. "Tell her I'm grateful," he said. "Grace speaks so little since her mother died. The drawing helps her express what she can't say." As Maya conveyed his words, a creak from the loft announced Luke's awakening. The boy descended the ladder slowly, his face composed but his eyes revealing a night of little sleep and much thought. "Morning, Pa," he said quietly. "Son," Thorn replied, carefully neutral. "Sleep well." Luke shrugged. "Well enough." He moved to the table and accepted a cup of coffee from Maya with a nod of thanks, a small gesture, but one that made Thorne's heart lift slightly. Perhaps his son had made peace with at least some of what he learned yesterday. They ate breakfast in relative silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the day ahead. When the meal was finished, Thorne outlined the plan they had developed the night before. "Luke, you'll help me move the livestock to the far pasture after breakfast," he said. "Maya and Wachiwi will prepare the house, boarding up the windows, filling water barrels, in case we're here for a while." He turned to Helona. "Would you be willing to show Grace the cave you marked on the map? It's important she knows where to go if things turn bad." Maya translated, and Helona nodded, reaching out to touch Grace's hand with gentle fingers. The child smiled shyly, the first genuine smile Thorne had seen from her in longer than he cared to admit. "Good," Thorne said. "We have until sundown to prepare. Let's make every minute count." As they dispersed to their tasks, Luke lingered behind, waiting until the others had moved out of earshot before speaking. "Pa," he said hesitantly. "About yesterday." Thorne braced himself, uncertain whether his son was about to declare his loyalty or his intention to stand aside when Blackwood came. "I'm still processing everything," Luke continued. "The lies, the name change, all of it, but—" He straightened his shoulders, looking suddenly older than his 14 years. "When Blackwood comes, I'll stand with you. With our family." Relief washed over Thorne in a wave so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That means more than you know." Luke nodded, once uncomfortable with the moment's intensity. "Better get to those cattle," he said, turning toward the door. "They won't move themselves." Thorne watched him go, pride and fear warring in his chest. His son had chosen to stand with him, despite everything, a gift he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he would honor with every breath he took. Outside, the day was warming quickly, the sun climbing toward its zenith in a cloudless sky. As Thorne joined Luke in moving the cattle to the far pasture, he couldn't help scanning the horizon repeatedly, half expecting to see riders appearing despite Blackwood's promise of sundown. The hours passed in a flurry of activity. Windows were boarded, water-stored weapons cleaned and loaded. By mid-afternoon, they had done all they could to prepare. The farm stood ready, as fortified as they could make it, with limited time and resources. Thorne gathered everyone in the main room for a final review of the plan. "If Blackwood comes peacefully, which I doubt, I'll try to reason with him," he said. "If that fails, we defend the house. Luke and I will take the front. Wachiwi, you'll watch the back door." He turned to Helona and Grace. "If shooting starts, you two head for the cave immediately. Take the trail we marked this morning. Stay there until one of us comes for you or until you're sure it's safe." Finally, he looked at Maya. "You'll be their main target. I want you to stay inside, away from the windows. Your job is to protect Grace and Helona if they can't make it to the cave." Maya shook her head firmly. "I will stand with you," she said. "This fight is as much mine as yours." Before Thorne could argue, Luke spoke up. "Pa, someone's coming. Fast." They all moved to the window where Luke had pulled back a corner of the boarding to keep watch. A cloud of dust on the horizon marked a lone rider approaching at a gallop, too early to be Blackwood and his men. "Who is it?" Thorne asked, squinting against the afternoon sun. Luke watched a moment longer as the rider drew closer. "I can't tell. Not the sheriff, though. Smaller." Thorne made a decision. "Everyone inside. Luke, rifle ready, but don't shoot unless I signal. I'll meet them in the yard." He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed downward and waited as the rider thundered into the yard in a spray of dust and pebbles. As the dust cleared, Thorne's heart nearly stopped. The rider was a woman, her dark hair coming loose from a once neat bun, her riding skirt torn and dusty. She reined in her lathered horse sharply, her eyes finding Thorne with desperate intensity. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying across the yard like a ghost from the past. "They're coming. Daniel and his men, they've been drinking, and they're talking about burning you out, about hanging you for a traitor." 15 years fell away in an instant. Despite the lines time had etched around her eyes and mouth, despite the gray threading through her dark hair, Thorne would have known her anywhere. "Elizabeth," he breathed the name, catching in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Thorne stood frozen on the porch, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the ghost who had haunted his dreams for 15 years. Elizabeth Blackwood, older now, her face bearing the marks of time and hardship, but unmistakably the woman he had once promised to marry. "Elizabeth," he said again, his voice steadier this time. "What are you doing here?" She dismounted quickly, her movements betraying urgency despite her obvious exhaustion. "There's no time," she said, approaching the porch. "Daniel gathered men from the saloon, 15, maybe 20. They've been drinking since noon, talking about justice and traitors." Her eyes, still the same deep blue he remembered, met his with desperate intensity. "They mean to kill you, Thomas, and anyone who stands with you." From the doorway behind him, Thorne heard a sharp intake of breath. He turned to find Luke standing there, rifle half raised, his young face a mask of confusion, as he looked from his father to the woman he'd heard about only yesterday. "Is that—" he began. "Elizabeth Blackwood," Thorne confirmed. "Luke, take her horse to the barn, make sure it's watered, then come straight back." Luke hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but finally nodded and moved past them to take the reins of Elizabeth's exhausted mount. As Luke led the horse away, Thorne turned back to Elizabeth. "How did you know where to find me? I've been Thorne Mason for 15 years. "I've always known," she said simply. "Daniel came home after Apache passed telling everyone you'd deserted, but I never believed it. When he was drunk enough, he'd sometimes let things slip, fragments of the truth. I pieced it together over the years." Her expression hardened. "I know what my brother did, Thomas. What he ordered those men to do." A thousand questions crowded Thorne's mind, but there was no time for them now. "Come inside," he said, gesturing toward the door. "We need to prepare." As they entered the cabin, Maya stepped forward from where she'd been standing in the shadows. Her eyes moved between Thorne and Elizabeth, taking in the obvious history between them, with a carefully neutral expression. "This is Maya," Thorne said simply, "and Wachiwi and Helona." He nodded toward the other women. "They're the reason Blackwood's coming." Elizabeth looked at the three Apache women, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The women from yesterday's auction," she said. "Daniel was in a fury when he came home saying you'd interfered again." She turned back to Thorne. "You never could stand by when something was wrong, could you?" There was something in her voice, not quite accusation, not quite admiration, that made Thorne uncomfortable. Before he could respond, Grace peeked out from behind Helona, her solemn eyes fixed on Elizabeth with undisguised curiosity. "And who is this?" Elizabeth asked, her voice softening as she knelt to the child's level. "My daughter Grace," Thorne said. "And you've met Luke, my son." Elizabeth nodded, a flicker of something like pain crossing her features before she schooled them into neutrality. "They have Catherine's eyes," she observed quietly. The mention of his late wife sent a pang through Thorne's chest. "Yes," he agreed, "they do." An awkward silence fell, heavy with unspoken history and complicated emotions. Maya broke it, her practical nature asserting itself. "If more men are coming, we must finish preparing," she said. "How much time do we have?" This last was directed at Elizabeth. "An hour, maybe less," Elizabeth replied, seeming grateful for the shift in focus. "They were still gathering when I left, but Daniel won't wait long once they're all armed." Thorne moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards toward the road that led to town. "Luke said 15 to 20 men." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Most are just along for the spectacle, or because Daniel's been buying the drinks. But some," she hesitated, "some have old grudges against the Apache. They won't hesitate to kill." Thorne absorbed this, his mind racing through options. The original plan had assumed they'd be facing Blackwood, and perhaps a handful of deputies, not a mob of 20 armed and liquored-up men. "We can't defend the house against those numbers," he said finally, "not without risking everyone inside." He turned to Maya. "The cave Helona showed us, could it hold all of us?" Maya conferred briefly with Helona, then nodded. "Yes, but getting there unseen with so many would be difficult." "Not if we split up," Thorne decided. "Take different routes, meet at the cave." He looked at Elizabeth. "Did they see you leave town? Are they following you?" She shook her head. "I don't think so. I slipped out while Daniel was still at the saloon. Told Mrs. Porter I was going to visit a sick friend outside town." Luke returned from the barn, slightly breathless. "Horses taken care of," he reported. "What's the plan?" Thorne quickly outlined the new strategy, abandoning the house in favor of the hidden cave, splitting into smaller groups to make tracking more difficult, meeting at the designated location to wait out Blackwood's initial fury. "Once they find the house empty, they'll either burn it and leave or set up watch," he explained. "Either way, we'll have better options from the cave than trapped in here." "What about our things?" Luke asked, gesturing around the cabin that had been their home for 10 years. "If they burn it, things can be replaced," Thorne said firmly. "Lives can't." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll take what we can carry, but nothing more. Understand?" Luke nodded reluctantly, the reality of their situation sinking in. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now here's how we'll split up." Thorne moved to the table where Helona's map still lay. "Maya, you'll take Grace and Helona along the eastern trail. Luke, you and Wachiwi will take the ridge path to the north." He traced the routes with his finger. "Elizabeth and I will create a diversion, then follow the creek bed west before doubling back to the cave." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "The creek bed is the most exposed route," she observed. "And you would take it with the woman least familiar with this land." "Elizabeth rode with me when we were younger," Thorne said. "She knows how to move through rough country, and the creek bed, while exposed, is also the fastest route if we need to draw pursuers away from the others." He didn't add that keeping Elizabeth with him also meant he could watch her, trust her warning. Though he might, 15 years was a long time, and the bond between siblings was strong. Part of him couldn't help wondering if she had been sent to delay them, to keep them in place until Blackwood arrived. Maya seemed to read his thoughts, or at least the caution behind them. She nodded once, accepting his decision without further comment. "Everyone pack only what you can carry," Thorne instructed. "Food, water, one blanket each, and weapons if you can use them." He glanced at the window, judging the angle of the sun. "We leave in 15 minutes. As the others scattered to gather their few possessions, Elizabeth touched Thorne's arm lightly. "Thomas," she said quietly, using the name he had shed so long ago. "I need to tell you something." "There's no time," he began. "Take time," she insisted, her voice low but intense. Daniel doesn't just want the Apache women. He wants something he thinks you have. Thorne frowned. What are you talking about? A letter, Elizabeth said, written by the fort commander after Apache passed, documenting what really happened there. A letter that would prove Daniel ordered the massacre against direct orders that would expose him as the criminal, not you. Thorne's blood ran cold. There is no letter, he said. If there had been, I would have used it years ago to clear my name. Daniel believes there is, Elizabeth pressed. He's convinced himself you've been hiding it all these years, waiting for the right moment to destroy him. It's become an obsession with him, Thomas. He sees conspiracies everywhere, believes every Apache in the territory is working with you to undermine him. He's delusional, Thorne said flatly. There was never any letter. The commander at Fort Bowie was Blackwood's friend. He'd have never documented what happened. Elizabeth's face fell. Then there's truly nothing to negotiate with, she said. Daniel won't stop until... She couldn't finish the sentence. Until I'm dead, Thorne completed grimly. I've known that for 15 years, Elizabeth. It's why I became someone else, why I stayed away from town as much as possible. He sighed heavily. I just never thought he'd find me like this. Before Elizabeth could respond, Luke approached a small pack slung over his shoulder and his rifle in hand. Everyone's ready, Pa, he said, his young face set in determined lines. Thorne nodded, pushing aside the weight of the past to focus on the immediate future. Then it's time to go, he said. Remember, if anything happens, the cave is the meeting point. No one waits for stragglers, no one plays hero. Clear. Luke nodded, then turned to Elizabeth. Ma'am, he said formally, thank you for the warning. You didn't have to risk yourself for us. Elizabeth's eyes softened as she looked at the boy. I've made many mistakes in my life, she said quietly. Letting your father face this alone won't be another one. Something in her words struck Thorne as odd, a note of finality or resignation, but there was no time to question it. Outside, the shadows were lengthening, marking the approach of the hour when Blackwood and his men would arrive. Move out, Thorne ordered, and God go with you all. Maya led Grace and Helona along the eastern trail, moving swiftly but carefully through the scrub brush and scattered pine trees that dotted the hillside. The path was narrow and rocky, barely visible to untrained eyes, but Helona moved with the confidence of one who knew the land intimately. Grace followed close behind, her small face serious but unafraid. In the few days since the Apache women had arrived, the child had formed a deep bond with Helona, seeming to sense in the sorrowful woman a kindred spirit who understood loss without needing words to explain it. Maya kept a steady pace, pausing occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit and to check that the others were keeping up. Her mind, however, was divided, part focused on their immediate safety, part lingering on the cabin they had left behind, where Thorne and the woman called Elizabeth would soon begin their diversion. The woman from his past. The one he had been engaged to marry before fate and violence had torn them apart. Maya had seen the way Elizabeth looked at Thorne with a mixture of pain, regret, and something deeper that spoke of feelings never fully laid to rest. And she had seen how Thorne looked at Elizabeth with caution, yes, but also with a flicker of recognition of shared history that Maya could never be part of. It shouldn't matter, she told herself firmly. What mattered was survival, getting to the cave, safely protecting Grace and Helona, living to see another dawn. And yet the image of Thorne and Elizabeth standing together on the porch, the tension and familiarity between them palpable, even from a distance, lingered in her mind like a splinter working its way deeper. A small hand slipped into hers, drawing Maya from her thoughts. Grace looked up at her with solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for her 9 years. Papa will come, the child said simply, her rare words carrying absolute certainty. Maya squeezed the small hand gently. Yes, she agreed, he will come. Whether he would come alone or with Elizabeth at his side was a question Maya pushed from her mind as they continued along the twisting path towards safety. Luke moved with surprising stealth for a boy raised on a farm, picking his way along the ridge path, with Wachiwi close behind him. The tall Apache woman matched his pace easily, her powerful frame belying a natural grace as she navigated the rocky terrain. They had traveled in silence for nearly half an hour, both alert for any sign of Blackwood's men, when Luke finally spoke. That woman, he said quietly. Elizabeth. She was engaged to my father before he met my mother. It wasn't a question, but Wachiwi made a small sound of acknowledgement, indicating she was listening, despite the language barrier between them. He called her name sometimes. Luke continued, more to himself than to his companion, in his sleep or when he was feverish. I always wondered who she was. He glanced back at Wachiwi. Strange to finally meet her like this, after all these years. Wachiwi said nothing, but her dark eyes were thoughtful as they continued along the path. Luke found her silence oddly comforting. Not judgmental or disinterested, but patient, as if she understood that some thoughts needed to be spoken aloud without requiring a response. My father's not who I thought he was, he said, after another stretch of silence. Not entirely, anyway. He had a whole life before my mother, before me. A different name, even. He kicked a small stone, watching it skitter down the slope. Makes me wonder how much of what I know about him is real. Wachiwi spoke then a few words in Apache that Luke couldn't understand. But her tone was gentle, and when he turned to look at her, she placed a hand over her heart, then gestured toward the distant horizon where the cabin lay. You think his heart is true, Luke interpreted, even if his name isn't. He considered this. Maybe you're right. He's always taught me to do what's right no matter how hard it is. A small smile touched his lips. Guess he was speaking from experience. They continued in companionable silence, each step taking them closer to the cave where they would reunite with the others, where Luke would see whether his father's diversion had succeeded or whether the past had finally claimed the man who had once been Captain Thomas Monroe. Thorne and Elizabeth waited until the others had a substantial head start on before beginning their preparations. The plan was simple but risky. Create enough noise and movement around the cabin to draw Blackwood's attention, then slip away along the creek bed while the sheriff and his men were focused on the house. You should take a horse, Thorne said as he checked the priming on his rifle one last time. The creek bed's rocky in places and will need to move fast. Elizabeth shook her head. I ride better than you ever did, Thomas, she said, a ghost of old teasing in her voice. I'll keep up. Thorne acknowledged this with a nod, remembering the young woman who had outpaced him on many a ride through the Virginia countryside where they had both grown up. Before the war, before the West, before everything had changed. Why did you really come? He asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at him since her arrival. After 15 years, why risk everything to warn me? Elizabeth's gaze didn't waver. Because I knew the truth, she said simply. All these years, while Daniel spread his lies about you deserting, about you being a coward, I knew. Not the details, perhaps, but I knew you would never abandon your men or your duty without good reason. How, Thorne pressed. How could you be so sure when everyone else believed the worst? A sad smile touched Elizabeth's lips. Because I knew your heart, Thomas. Better perhaps than you knew it yourself. Before Thorne could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached their ears, many horses approaching fast. Their time had run out. Ready? He asked, moving toward the door. Elizabeth nodded, her face suddenly composed and determined. Ready? Together they stepped onto the porch just as the first riders appeared on the horizon, a dust cloud resolving into mounted men, rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun. At their head rode Sheriff Daniel Blackwood, his black coat and hat making him a dark silhouette against the golden landscape. Here we go, Thorne murmured, raising his rifle to fire a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed across the valley, momentarily freezing the approaching riders. Let's make them think we're preparing to defend the house. Elizabeth moved to the corner of the porch, waving a cloth as if signaling to others. They'll think you have men positioned around the property, she explained. Thorne fired again, this time aiming well wide of the riders, but close enough to kick up dust near their horses' hooves. The animals reared and bucked, temporarily throwing the formation into chaos. They'll regroup quickly, Elizabeth warned. Daniel won't be deterred by a few shots. I'm counting on it, Thorne replied. We just need them focused on the house long enough for the others to reach the cave. He could see Blackwood gesturing to his men, splitting them into groups to approach from multiple directions. It was the move of a trained military officer, methodical, strategic, and exactly what Thorne had anticipated. Time to go, he said, touching Elizabeth's arm lightly. Around the back then, down to the creek bed. Stay low and move fast. They slipped through the house and out in the back door, crouching low as they made their way toward the small gully that led down to the creek. Behind them, the first shots rang out, Blackwood's men firing at the seemingly defended house and expecting resistance that wasn't there. They'll figure it out soon enough, Thorne said, as they half slid, half ran down the steep bank to the creek bed. We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible before they realize the house is empty. The creek was mostly dry this time of year, just a trickle of water down the center of a wide rocky channel. It offered good cover in its deeper sections, but would leave them exposed when it shallowed out over the rocky flats. They moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, stumbling occasionally on loose stones, but maintaining a steady pace away from the cabin. Behind them, the gunfire had intensified, Blackwood's men laying down covering fire as they advanced on the house. How long do you think it will take them to realize no one's shooting back? Elizabeth asked, her breath coming in short gasps as they rounded a bend in the creek. Not long, Thorne admitted. Blackwood's many things, but he's not stupid. 5 minutes, maybe 10. They pressed on the creek bed, gradually deepening as it carved its way through the hills. The gunfire behind them had stopped, a silence more ominous than the previous shooting. They know, Elizabeth said, pausing to catch her breath. They'll be coming after us soon. Thorne nodded grimly. We need to leave the creek before the next bend. There's a side canyon that leads up toward the cave, but it's steep going. Elizabeth glanced back the way they had come, her expression unreadable in the fading light. You go, she said suddenly. I'll continue along the creek, draw them away from the canyon. What? No, Thorne shook his head emphatically. We stay together. Be practical, Thomas, Elizabeth insisted. You know this land better than I do. You can reach the cave and the others. I can lead Daniel on a chase long enough to give you time. And then what? Thorne demanded. When he catches you, which he will, what do you think he'll do to his own sister when he realizes you've betrayed him? A strange smile crossed Elizabeth's face, sad and resolute, and somehow final. Daniel won't hurt me, she said. He never could. Something in her tone sent a chill through Thorne's body. Elizabeth, he said slowly, what are you not telling me? She looked away toward the darkening eastern sky. I'm dying, Thomas, she said quietly. A growth in my breast spread too far for the doctors to help. 6 months, they said. Maybe less. The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. Elizabeth, why? Don't, she cut him off. I didn't come here for your pity. I came because I couldn't let Daniel destroy what remains of the man I once loved. Her eyes, when they met his, were clear and determined. Let me do this, Thomas. Let me make things right in what time I have left. Before Thorne could respond, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, distant still, but growing closer. Blackwood and his men had discovered the ruse and were now in pursuit. Go, Elizabeth urged, giving him a gentle push toward the side canyon. Your children need you. Those women need you. Her voice softened. Maya needs you. Thorne stared at her, struck by her perception and the selflessness of what she was proposing. I can't just leave you, he said, though part of him recognized the logic of her plan. You already did 15 years ago, Elizabeth said, but there was no bitterness in her tone, only a gentle acknowledgement of their shared past. And it was the right choice then, too. You followed your conscience at Apache Pass, and you found love with Catherine afterward. She smiled sadly. Some people are meant to meet, Thomas, but not meant to stay together. Perhaps that was us. The hoofbeats were closer now, accompanied by shouts, as Blackwood's men spotted signs of their passage along the creek bed. Go, Elizabeth said again, more urgently. I'll lead them south away from the canyon. Give me your hat and coat in this light. From a distance, they'll think I'm you. Thorne hesitated only a moment longer, then shrugged out of his coat and handed it to her, along with his hat. Elizabeth, he said, her name catching in his throat. Thank you for everything. She slipped the coat on over her riding clothes, tucking her hair up under the hat. Live well, Thomas, she said simply. Make this second chance count. Without waiting for his response, she turned and continued down the creek bed, her figure soon lost in the gathering dusk. Thorne watched her go, a complicated mix of emotions churning in his chest, gratitude, regret, admiration, and a deep sadness for what might have been in another lifetime. Then he turned and began the steep climb up the side canyon toward the cave where the others waited toward the future, whatever it might hold. Maya paced the entrance to the cave, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape for any sign of movement. Luke and Wachiwi had arrived nearly an hour ago, reporting no sign of pursuit along their route. Grace and Helona sat deeper within the cave, the child sleeping with her head in the woman's lap, while Helona stroked her hair with gentle fingers. But of Thorne and Elizabeth there was no sign. They should have been here by now, Luke said, joining Maya at the entrance. The boy's face was drawn with worry, his eyes constantly moving between the two trails that led toward their hiding place. Yes, Maya agreed, simply not wanting to voice the fears that had been growing with each passing minute. Had they been captured? Had Blackwood's men overtaken them? Or a thought that came unbidden and unwelcome, had they chosen a different path altogether? One that led away from the cave and those who waited there, as darkness fell, completely blanketing the land in deep shadow, broken only by starlight. Maya made a decision. I will go look for them, she said, checking the knife at her belt, the only weapon she had brought. I'm coming with you, Luke said, immediately reaching for his rifle. Maya shook her head. You must stay with the others. Protect your sister and Helona. Wachiwi can do that, Luke argued. She's stronger than both of us combined, and I know these hills better than you do. Before Maya could respond, a shadow detached itself from the larger darkness near the canyon path. Both she and Luke froze, weapons ready, as the figure approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. It's me, Thorne's voice came softly through the night. Just me. Relief flooded through Maya, so intense it made her knees weak for a moment. Thorne, she breathed, moving forward to meet him. Luke was faster, rushing to his father and embracing him fiercely. But we were worried. Where's Miss Elizabeth? Thorne returned his son's embrace, then met Maya's eyes over the boy's shoulder. What she saw there, a mixture of grief, regret, and grim acceptance, told her everything she needed to know. Elizabeth chose to lead them away from us, Thorne said quietly as they moved into the shelter of the cave. She's buying us time. Will they hurt her? Grace asked sleepily, having woken at her father's return. The bad men. Thorne knelt beside his daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. No, sweetheart, he said. She's the sheriff's sister. He won't hurt her. The words were meant to reassure Grace, but Maya heard the doubt beneath them. Blackwood was a man consumed by hatred and paranoia. Even if family ties might not stay his hand if he felt betrayed. What now? Luke asked, his young face serious in the dim light filtering into the cave. We can't stay here forever. No, Thorne agreed, but we can wait until morning. Blackwood and his men won't risk searching these hills in the dark. The terrain's too dangerous and they don't know it like we do. He glanced around the cave, taking in their meager supplies and the exhausted faces of his unlikely family. Try to get some rest, he said. Tomorrow we'll decide our next move. As the others settled down on blankets spread over the cave floor, Thorne moved to sit beside Maya near the entrance. For a time, they sat in silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead and listening for any sound that might indicate pursuit. She told me to go, Thorne said, finally, his voice so low that only Maya could hear. Said that you needed me, that my children needed me. Maya glanced at him, surprised by the admission. She barely knows me, she said. She knows enough, Thorne replied. Elizabeth always could see through to the heart of things. He hesitated, then added quietly, she's dying. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Understanding dawned in Maya's eyes. That is why she was willing to risk herself, she said. She has already made peace with death. Thorne nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I think so. Her last gift to me, to all of us, was time. Time to find another way forward. And have you, ma'am, Maya asked, found a way forward? Thorne turned to look at her, really look at her for what felt like the first time since Elizabeth's arrival had thrown everything into chaos. In the starlight filtering into the cave, Maya's face was shadowed but beautiful, her eyes reflecting pinpoints of light like tiny galaxies. I'm starting to see one, he said softly. If you are willing to walk it with me. Maya held his gaze, her expression serious but not unwelcoming. First we must survive tomorrow, she said practically. Then we can speak of paths and futures. Thorne smiled slightly, appreciating her pragmatism, even as he recognized it as a gentle deflection. Fair enough, he agreed. First, we survive. They lapsed into comfortable silence, keeping watch together as the night deepened around them, and their companions slept unaware of the quiet understanding that had passed between the two sentinels, guarding their rest. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that gradually gave way to the deep blue of a cloudless autumn day. Inside the cave, the small group stirred, waking to the reality of their situation and the decisions that lay ahead. Thorne had spent the last hour of his watch scouting the immediate area, looking for signs that Blackwood's men had tracked them during the night. Finding none, he returned to the cave as the others were preparing a cold breakfast from their meager supplies. Any sign of them? Luke asked, passing his father a piece of jerky and a canteen of water. Thorne shook his head. Nothing fresh. They either lost our trail or... He didn't finish the thought, but everyone understood the implication, or Elizabeth's diversion had been too successful, drawing Blackwood's full fury onto herself. What's the plan, Pa? Luke pressed his young face, serious but determined. We can't hide out here forever. Thorne looked around at the small group that fate had brought together, his children, the 3 Apache women who had somehow become intertwined with his destiny, all looking to him for direction. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. We have a few options, he said finally. We could try to make it to the next town. Silver Creek is about 30 miles east. Or we could head for the reservation at San Carlos, where Maya and the others would at least have some legal protection. Maya shook her head firmly at this. San Carlos is a place of death, not sanctuary, she said. The agents there are corrupt and the conditions worse than prison. We would not survive a winter there. Thorne nodded, having heard similar reports about the reservation conditions. Then Silver Creek might be our best bet, he said. It's outside Blackwood's jurisdiction. We could resupply there, maybe find work until we decide on a more permanent solution. Or, said a new voice from the cave entrance, you could stop running and face this thing once and for all. They all turned sharply, weapons rising instinctively toward the silhouetted figure standing in the cave mouth. As the person stepped forward into the light, Thorne's breath caught in his throat. Elizabeth. She looked exhausted, her riding clothes torn and dirty dark circles shadowing her eyes. But she was alive and apparently unharmed. How did you find us? Thorne asked as Luke quickly moved to offer her water. Elizabeth drank deeply before answering. I know my brother, she said simply. I knew he'd follow me rather than search for a trail he couldn't see. I led him and his men on a chase halfway to the Mexican border before doubling back. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I always was the better rider in the family. Is he still following you? Luke asked anxiously, peering past her toward the cave entrance. No, Elizabeth said. I lost them in a box canyon about 10 miles south of here. They'll be searching that area for some time, I expect. Thorne studied her face, noting the resolve in her eyes. You said we should stop running, he prompted. What did you mean? Elizabeth looked around at the group, her gaze lingering on Grace and Helena, sitting together on Wachiwi's proud stance on Maya's watchful eyes before returning to Thorne. I mean that running only delays the inevitable, she said. Daniel will never stop hunting you, Thomas. Not while he believes you have something that could destroy him. The letter that doesn't exist, Thorne said with a sigh. Exactly. Elizabeth nodded. But what if it did? A tense silence followed her words as everyone processed the implication. You want to fake evidence against your own brother? Luke asked, clearly shocked by the suggestion. Elizabeth's face hardened. My brother died years ago, she said quietly. The man wearing his skin now is consumed by hatred and fear. He ordered the massacre of innocent people, then blamed the one man who tried to stop it. He spent 15 years hunting that man, willing to destroy anyone who gets in his way. She looked directly at Thorne. Including your family. Including these women. Thorne shook his head slowly. Even if we created this fictional letter, who would believe it? Blackwood is the law in Willow Springs. His word against mine, a man who's been living under an assumed name for 15 years. Not just your word, Elizabeth said. Mine as well. And I've brought something else. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I found this in Daniel's desk years ago. I've kept it knowing someday it might be needed. Thorne took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, the handwriting unmistakably Blackwood's, addressed to a superior officer at Fort Bowie shortly after Apache Pass. As Thorne read, his face grew grim. He admits it, he said, finally looking up at the others. Not directly, but between the lines. He talks about taking necessary action when Monroe hesitated, about ensuring the Apache threat was eliminated despite resistance from certain officers. It's not a confession, Elizabeth acknowledged, but combined with my testimony about things he said over the years when drunk, and with Maya's eyewitness account of what happened at Apache Pass, it might be enough, Thorne finished. Not to convict him, perhaps, but enough to cast serious doubt on his version of events, enough to make people question who the real criminal is. Maya moved closer, her eyes intent on Thorne's face. You would risk this, she asked, revealing yourself as Thomas Monroe, facing whatever consequences might come. Thorne met her gaze steadily. I've been running for 15 years, he said, living in fear that my past would catch up with me, that Blackwood would find me and destroy everything I care about. His eyes moved to his children, then back to Maya. Maybe it's time to stop running. Luke stepped forward, standing tall beside his father. I'm with you, Pa, he said firmly. Whatever you decide. Grace, sensing the gravity of the moment, slipped her small hand into Thorne's. Me too, Papa, she whispered. Wachiwi and Helona exchanged glances, then nodded their agreement. The decision, it seemed, was unanimous. Then it's settled. Thorne said, a weight lifting from his shoulders even as a new tension took its place. We go back to Willow Springs. We face Blackwood with the truth, all of it. There's something else you should know, Elizabeth said, her expression serious. When I was in town yesterday before all this started, I overheard something at the general store. The territorial marshal is due in Willow Springs today or tomorrow, a routine visit, but timely for our purposes. Thorne's eyebrows rose at this news. The marshal would have authority over Blackwood, he said thoughtfully, and no personal stake in the matter. Exactly, Elizabeth nodded. If we can present our case to him instead of being at Daniel's mercy, we might actually have a chance, Thorne finished. He looked around at the others, a plan forming in his mind. Here's what we'll do. The sun was high overhead when they reached the outskirts of Willow Springs, approaching from the east along the main road rather than trying to conceal their arrival. Thorne rode at the front, Elizabeth beside him with the others following in a tight group. They had taken time to clean up as best they could at a small stream, wanting to present themselves with as much dignity as possible for what lay ahead. Thorne had shaved using his knife in the small mirror Luke carried for signaling and had donned his cleanest shirt from the supplies they'd brought. The town appeared quiet as they approached the usual midday lull when most people were indoors avoiding the heat. A few heads turned as they rode down the main street, expressions ranging from surprise to outright hostility. The marshal's horse, Elizabeth murmured, nodding toward a fine bay stallion tied outside the sheriff's office. He's here. Thorne nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding through him. They had timed their arrival well, perhaps too well. If Blackwood had returned from his futile chase, he would be inside that office right now, possibly already poisoning the marshal's ear against them. As they drew closer to the sheriff's office, the door swung open and 3 men stepped onto the porch. The first was Blackwood himself, his face thunderous with barely contained rage as he spotted their approaching party. Behind him stood a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of authority, the territorial marshal. The third man, to Thorne's surprise, was Pastor Thomas from the small church at the edge of town. Thorne reined in his horse a few yards from the office, the others stopping behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel, Elizabeth broke the silence, her voice remarkably calm. I'd like you to meet Marshal Harrington from the territorial office. Marshal, this is my brother, Sheriff Daniel Blackwood. The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly at this introduction, his gaze moving between Elizabeth and the furious sheriff. Ma'am, he acknowledged with a slight nod. Sheriff Blackwood and I were just discussing some irregularities in the local law enforcement practices. Blackwood's face flushed dark with anger. These people are trespassing in my town, he snarled. That man, he jabbed a finger toward Thorne, is a deserter from the United States Army and a traitor who abandoned his men in hostile territory 15 years ago. Is that so? The marshal asked mildly, turning his attention to Thorne. And you would be, Thorne straightened in his saddle, meeting the marshal's gaze directly. My name is Thomas Monroe, he said clearly, reclaiming his original identity for the first time in 15 years. Formerly Captain 4th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Bowie, and I have never deserted my post or my men. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation playing out in the center of town. He's lying, Blackwood spat. I was there. I saw him run, left us to face the Apache alone while he saved his own skin. Actually, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. That's not what happened at all, and I have proof. She reached into her jacket, drawing out the letter they had discussed in the cave. This is a letter written by my brother shortly after the incident at Apache Pass. In it, he admits to disobeying Captain Monroe's direct order to stand down, admits to attacking an Apache camp of civilians rather than the raiders they were sent to find. She handed the letter to the marshal, who read it carefully, his expression giving nothing away. This is a serious accusation, he said, finally looking up from the paper. Sheriff Blackwood, do you recognize this letter? Blackwood's face had gone from red to ashen. That's a personal communication, he blustered, taken from my private desk. It proves nothing. Perhaps not alone, the marshal agreed, but I understand there are witnesses to the events at Apache Pass. His gaze moved to Maya, who sat straight and proud on her horse. You were there, ma'am, Maya nodded, meeting his eyes without flinching. I was there, she confirmed. I saw this man, she gestured to Blackwood, order his soldiers to fire on our camp. Women, children, elders, no warriors, no weapons except for hunting tools. When Captain Monroe tried to stop the killing, this man attacked him, left him for dead. She's lying, Blackwood shouted, his composure cracking. She's an Apache, a savage. Her word means nothing against mine. And what about my word? Pastor Thomas spoke for the first time, his quiet voice somehow cutting through Blackwood's rage. I was a corporal in your unit, Sheriff. I was at Apache Pass that day. Thorne stared at the pastor in shock. He hadn't recognized the man. 15 years had changed the young corporal into a middle-aged minister. But as he looked closer, he could see the familiar features beneath the lines of age and experience. Thomas, the pastor nodded to him. Captain, it's been a long time. Corporal Peterson. Thorne acknowledged the name coming back to him from the depths of memory. It's Pastor Thomas now, the man corrected gently. I found a different calling after what I witnessed that day. He turned to the marshal. I've kept my silence for 15 years out of shame for my part in what happened, but I can no longer stand by while an innocent man is persecuted. You're all conspiring against me. Blackwood snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. I won't stand for it. I wouldn't, the marshal said calmly, his own hand resting casually near his sidearm. That would just add attempted murder of a federal officer to your troubles, Sheriff. Blackwood froze his eyes, darting between the Marshal Thorne and the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation. Desperately, he turned to the onlookers. You know me, he appealed. I've been your sheriff for 15 years. Are you going to take the word of a deserter and a bunch of savages over mine? There was a murmur among the crowd, but no one stepped forward to support him. Even Mrs. Porter, who had never shown Thorne any particular kindness, stood with arms crossed, her expression troubled as she looked between the two men. Daniel, Elizabeth said softly, dismounting and approaching her brother. It's over. The truth is out now. You pay, Blackwood breathed, turning on her with fury in his eyes. My own sister, you betrayed me for him. He gestured violently toward Thorne. I betrayed you for the truth, Elizabeth corrected gently. For the brother I used to know before hatred consumed him. For a moment it seemed Blackwood might lunge at her. Then, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, he seemed to collapse in on himself, the fight draining out of him all at once. Sheriff Daniel Blackwood, the marshal said formally, I'm relieving you of your duties pending a full investigation into the events at Apache Pass and your conduct as sheriff of Willow Springs. He gestured to two deputies who had emerged from the office. Take him inside. Keep him under guard. As Blackwood was led away, his eyes found Thorne's one last time. But there was no hatred there now, only a vast empty defeat, the look of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. The marshal turned to Thorne. Captain Monroe, he said, I'll need a full statement from you and all witnesses. There will be an official inquiry, you understand. Thorne nodded. I understand, and I'll cooperate fully. Good advice, the marshal said with a brisk nod. As for the matter of your irregular documentation for the past 15 years, I think we can sort that out without too much difficulty, given the circumstances. He glanced at Maya Wachiwi and Helena. And these ladies are under your protection, I understand. They are, Thorne confirmed. They were wrongfully captured and sold. They should be free to choose their own path forward. The marshal considered this, then nodded again. I'll make a note in my report. Given the testimony about what happened at Apache Pass, I think we can arrange for them to have protected status if they wish to remain in the territory. Maya exchanged glances with her companions, then spoke for all of them. We wish to stay, she said simply. Very well, the marshal said. Now I suggest you all get some rest. It's been quite a day and we have much to discuss tomorrow. He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. Ma'am, thank you for bringing this matter to my attention. As the marshal returned to the sheriff's office, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the unexpected turn of events. Some cast curious glances at Thorne and his unusual family, but there was more confusion than hostility in their looks. Pastor Thomas approached, extending his hand to Thorne. Captain, he said, or do you prefer Mr. Mason now? Thorne shook the offered hand, still trying to reconcile this dignified minister with the young soldier he had barely remembered. Thorne is fine, he said. It's been a long time, Corporal. Indeed it has, the pastor agreed. Too long for both of us to be carrying the weight of Apache Pass. Perhaps now we can both find some peace. He glanced at the group behind Thorne. You and your family are welcome to stay at the church until this matter is settled. It's not much, but it's clean and quiet. Thank you, Thorne said, genuinely touched by the offer. We'd be grateful. As Pastor Thomas led them toward the small church at the edge of town, and Elizabeth fell into step beside Thorne. Well, she said quietly, that went better than I expected. Thorne glanced at her, noting the weariness beneath her composed exterior. Thanks to you, he said. Without that letter, without your testimony. Elizabeth shook her head. I only did what I should have done years ago, she said. Perhaps if I had spoken up sooner, Daniel might not have gone so far down this dark path. Don't, Thorne said gently. You can't blame yourself for his choices. She smiled sadly. We all make our choices, Thomas. Daniel made his. I made mine. You made yours. Her gaze drifted to Maya, who walked ahead with Grace and Helena. And now you have a chance to make new ones. Thorne followed her gaze, understanding what she meant. Elizabeth, he began. Not entirely sure what he wanted to say. It's all right, she said, touching his arm lightly. What we had was beautiful, but it belongs to the past. You have a future waiting for you. She looked ahead at the small group that had somehow become his family. They need you, and I think you need them too. Before Thorne could respond, Luke dropped back to walk beside them. Pa, he said quietly, is it really over? Can we go home now? Thorne looked at his son, this boy who had shown such courage and loyalty through everything, and felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. Soon, he promised. We need to give our statements to the marshal, make sure Blackwood can't hurt anyone else. But yes, after that, we can go home. And they'll come with us, Luke asked, nodding toward Maya, Wachiwi, and Helena. They're part of our family now, right? Thorne glanced at Elizabeth, who smiled encouragingly, then back at his son. If they want to be, it shall be, he said. That's their choice to make. Luke nodded thoughtfully. I hope they choose us, he said simply, then hurried ahead to catch up with Grace. As they approached the church, Thorne found himself walking beside Maya, who had slowed her pace to match his. For a moment, they walked in silence, each processing the events of the day and what they might mean for the future. Your name is Thomas, Maya said finally. It suits you better than Thorne. He smiled slightly. I've been Thorne Mason so long, it might take some getting used to being Thomas Monroe again. Perhaps you can be both, Maya suggested, the man you were and the man you have become. Thorne considered this, liking the idea of integration rather than rejection of either identity. Perhaps, he agreed. Then gathering his courage, he asked, and where do you see yourself in this new future we're creating? Maya's eyes met his, direct and clear. I told you before, she said. I want a home. For myself, for Wachiwi and Helena. A place where we can live without fear. And would that home, Thorne asked carefully, be our farm with me and the children? A small smile touched Maya's lips. If we are invited, she said. You are, Thorne said simply. All of you. Maya nodded, satisfied with his answer. Then yes, she said. That is where I see myself, building something new from the ashes of the past. She glanced back at Elizabeth, who walked a few paces behind them. She is a good woman, your Elizabeth. She was never really mine, Thorne said quietly, just as I was never truly hers. We were young and the world was different then. And now, Maya asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes searching his face. Thorne stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Now, he said, I'm a man who has been given a second chance at life. A man who wants to build something meaningful with the years he has left. He held her gaze steadily. And I find myself hoping that you might want to build it with me. Maya studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she smiled, a true smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. I would like that, she said simply. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a beginning, a promise of possibility that was more than Thorne had dared to hope for when he'd placed $6 silver on an auctioneer's table just days ago. As they continued toward the church where Pastor Thomas waited to welcome them, Thorne felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The past had finally caught up with him, but instead of destroying him, it had somehow set him free. Elizabeth had been right. Some people were meant to meet, but not meant to stay together. And sometimes life gave you a second chance to find where you truly belonged. For $6, Thorne had purchased what he thought was a debt repaid. Instead, he had found a future he never expected, one built not on obligation or guilt, but on choice, courage, and the possibility of love. It was, he reflected as they crossed the threshold into their temporary sanctuary, the best bargain he had ever made. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Trian Tinkam, Sonnet 3.7.